Hi, welcome everyone. It's a pleasure to see everyone here. We'd like to start with thanking Eleanor for putting up this great event, a very important event for this time. Before we get started, we'd like to call upon Rabbi Raskin, the Rabbi of Chabad of Vermont, to start off with a psalm for the situation in the world in general and particularly in the land of Israel.
So this is Psalm 122. I'll first say it in Hebrew, then translate. Shir Hamai Lisla David Samachti Boimim Libeis Hadinoi Nelech Bingdus Ragaleinu B'Shalayich Yerushalayim Yerushalayim Apnuya Kir Shechu B'Lo Yachdav Sheshama Lu Shvatim Shiftei Yidus LeYisrael Lahodos L'Shem Adinoi Kishama Yashvu Chisus L'Mishpat Kisvis L'Beis David Shal U'Shleim Yerushalayim Shlo Yavoich Yehi Shalom B'Chelech Shalva Ba'amanoi Soich Leman Achai V'Reoi Adaban HaShalom Bach Leman Beis Adinoi Le'en Avat Shotev Lach. A song of ascent by David. I rejoiced when they said to me, let us go to the house of the Lord. Our feet were standing within your gates, O Jerusalem. Jerusalem that is built like a city in which all Israel is united together. For there the tribes went up, the tribes of God, and enjoyed upon Israel to offer praise to the name of the Lord. For there stood the seats of justice, the thrones of the house of David. Pray for peace for Jerusalem. May those who love you have peace. May there be peace within your walls, serenity within your mansions. For the sake of my brethren and friends, I ask that there be peace within you. For the sake of the house of the Lord our God, I seek your well-being. We should see that in front of our eyes very soon.
This talk is titled The Roots of the New Antisemitism, and we hope that it will answer today a question that we all have. In the time of social justice, diversity, inclusion, the hot-button topics on all campuses, it seems to be a rise of something that's the opposite of all those, the rise of anti-Semitism. And we hope to learn more about that and hear some insights about that problem. We have here Rabbi Usher Crisp, which for those that are in Burlington do not need to hear any introduction. He is a great scholar. He's co-director of inclusion.org. He lectures on AI, music, film, architecture, gender theory, psychology, education, economics, and much more. And we don't want to exclude anything. He's really any topic that you would like to know about. He seems to know a lot about. Sometimes when you introduce someone, you speak too much. It lessens what they say here. Really want to keep it short. So, Rabbi Usher Crisp.
Okay. We're doing karaoke, right? Okay. All right, stopping. I'm going to warn everyone to set their phones to stun. And I want to start right off the bat by thanking my wife here in the front row, who will be doing air traffic control. At a certain point, she's going to wave me down and tell me to begin landing my plane, okay? So I just want to warn you, lest you get concerned that we'll be okay. Normally, I have a hard time ensuring that every one of my talks is followed up by a certain sudden darkening of the sky. They usually don't do that, but occasionally I pull it off, so let's see what happens here. Anyway, I wanted to start off with a bit of an unusual exercise. And it's going to require everyone to do a little bit of simple math, if that's okay with you. So I'd like you to please, in your own mind, just add the following numbers. You don't have to write it down. You don't have to remember it. Just go through the exercise, please, of adding up the following numbers, okay? So 13 plus 6, 4 plus 55, 87 plus 2, 12 plus 52, 75 plus 26, 25 plus 52, 63 plus 32. All right, I know some of these can be hard, but try to keep up if you can. All right, here's the last one, okay? 123 plus 5. Okay, you with me? Now, quick, I want you to think of a color, and now I want you to think of a tool. Good? Everyone holds yourself. Can I have a show of hands? How many people thought red hammer? Okay. Pretty good. So it turns out in neuroscience, which is another topic that I have to deal a lot with, our brains create all kinds of shortcuts to help us function in the world in a very effective way. And one of those ways is that we often have a sort of filing system in the brain that keeps a best example in every given category ready at hand for you to respond to and to use in daily life, right? Because so much is bombarding us in terms of stimuli all the time, we can't think things through fresh. So it turns out if you repeat this experiment over and over again, and you do it properly, there's a couple of different ways of setting it up, you get between 80 and 98% of people will say red hammer, because the ideal color most people have as a reference is red, and the ideal tool that most people have is a hammer. So it just happens like that, right? So part of what's actually happening in the world today that's creating a lot of the intolerance and a lot of the vitriol and a lot of the conflict, and it extends way beyond anti-Semitism, actually has its roots in the brain and how our brains function in this world and how we take shortcuts. We do all kinds of shortcuts that prevent us from thinking through things fresh. The numbers were just a distraction at the beginning. Sorry, I put you through that. You might think that actually rabbis who get you to do math, that's the cause of anti-Semitism that's occurring today. I'm here to assure you that I don't think it is. But it's something to think about, right? So we use shortcuts all the time, and we use shortcuts in how we navigate the world, how we think about it, how we think about other people, how we think about topics, especially complex topics. I love it when one of the anchors on CNN says to a very complex issue to someone who has advanced degrees in that issue, so good or not good, could be reduced to one of those two things very, very quickly. And this takes us back to actually something that is in sort of ancient mythology, and it's actually transcultural, and we find it actually both in the Jewish tradition, in the Hebraic tradition, and also in the Greek tradition, mirrored in the same way. And so the story in the Talmud actually is talking about a little bit of deleted scenes and director commentary to various biblical episodes. Some people may know the whole story about Abraham, who goes down into a place called Sodom in Hebrew. And one of the deleted scenes, director commentary pieces, talks about how in that particular area, which was sort of had a very perverse sense of justice, there was an inn. And in the inn, there was an innkeeper. And the inn was all booked up with people trying to get to Burlington for the solar eclipse, apparently. But besides that, there was only one bed in this inn. It was of a specific length. And if the person who was the guest was too tall to fit the bed, the innkeeper would cut off their feet so that they would fit the bed. And if they were too short to fit the bed, the innkeeper would stretch them to fit the bed. Now, if you tell this to children, they'll never forget it because it's got all that kind of graphic violence thing associated with it. It's very dramatic, what's going on. Now, many people are probably more familiar with this from actually the Greek version of it, which is the bed of Procrustes. The Procrustean bed is the same exact story. Innkeeper, one bed, one size, fits all. And if you're too long or too short, well, we're going to radically modify you to be consistency. And it's actually a story about conformity and about trying to erase and disregard, often violently, individual differences, right? Like that's really deeply what's going on in terms of this procrastinating in bed. And sometimes we don't differentiate the uniqueness of people because we lump them together, we chunk them together, we generalize them and make grand, broad, sweeping generalizations. And as a result, this whole group becomes like a monolith, and everyone fits one label or description. And this has happened since time immemorial. It's part of what fuels historic anti-Semitism. Jews are like X, or this group is like Y. Fill in the blank, whatever it might be, like that we could subsume a very diverse population of individuals into like a single description that fits the whole setting. So it'd be a little bit like saying it would be as ridiculous today as saying like all women are the same. If someone made such a gross generalization, it would totally deny individual differences that were between one woman and another. But you can go even more extreme than that. You could say also, like, an individual woman is different from herself over time, right? Sometimes if I try to fit the same image of who I am consistently for years and years and decades, it doesn't work, right? When I lived here in Burlington more than 30 years ago, I had a different career path, trying to play lead guitar in a heavy metal band. It was a very different, pursuit than being a rabbi. Career counselor said rabbi or heavy metal band. Those were the two choices. I ended up picking rabbi. Didn't look good in spandex. So it was a choice, right? You go different ways, and we find over time I have to have the freedom to change. Like, I don't even rigidly conform to myself over time. That's part of growth, is it not? And yet so much of trying to summarize things up, summarize people up, summarize issues up is, again, putting them in the procrustean bed that just disregards. They may be a little bit shy of that description. They may exceed that description, but we'll cut it off because it fits very neatly. And it's like a mental shortcut, like the red hammer, that allows me to just navigate the world without having to think too much, because we don't want to have to think too much, right? We always like to go to the level of lowest energy. So if we're standing, we want to sit. If we're sitting, we want to lie down. If we're lying down, we want to dream and sleep. Right, we always want to go to lower and lower energy to conserve resources, and we do something very similar to that mentally. So that's one of the big issues. Now we can go even deeper into this, though, and actually see a kind of hieroglyphic encryption in the word Sodom itself in Hebrew, Sodom. And this word is made up of principally 3 Hebrew letters. The vowels are extra, so it's a little bit complex how that works if you don't know Hebrew. But each of these words, each of the letters that make up the name Sodom, actually themselves have symbolic representation. Hebrew letters have a hieroglyphic interpretation to them. Like, they have geometric form, so they can have a name, a pronunciation, but it also has a form to it. And the first letter of Sodom is, for the S sound, is the Hebrew letter Samech, which looks like a circle. So we have the letter that looks like a circle. Sounds like an S, looks like a circle. Then the middle letter is the letter Dalet in Hebrew, and it has a name associated with it. Dalet is a delet, a door. It's a door. And it's actually like a double hinged door that moves back and forth between the first letter, which is like a circle, and the last letter in Hebrew, which is a final mem, which looks like a square. So there's something very unusual happening in the name of this particular place in Hebrew that you wouldn't be able to decode if you didn't know what the Hebrew letters were all about, and that they have these other symbolic meanings, a circle and a square. What is the difference between those 2 letters, and how are they interpreted if we give them like a kind of psychology behind them, a symbolic meaning behind them? So first of all, a circle often expresses shivyon, which is equality. Everything's the same, right? We're the Knights of the Round Table. We're dancing in a circle. We're all equidistant from the center, right? No one's any closer or any farther away. And we live in an age where equality is exceptionally important to us. It's like one of the biggest buzzwords that there is in the political discourse. Everyone's talking about equality. Very, very important. So that's one of the letters that we have here. What is the square then? if it's going to be on the other side. You move through the door from one extreme to the other. The square is rectilinear. It is delineating something and like boxing it in some way, like defining it in a very rational way on all sides. And so that would be an image in rabbinic literature of something that is highly differentiated, very defined. If everything's equal, it's all the same in the circle. If everything's in the square, everything's all different. It's all fully differentiated. No two things are the same. And we tend to look at differentiation or difference usually in a highly politically charged way as well, right? We just like equality is a very important word, difference is also an important word. And usually we feel like the door swings one way or the other. Either we're like into like showing how we're all the same, or if we're talking about people being different, well, that could be dangerous things. Maybe that's like saying these people are different, they're less than, they're not as important. We're disparaging them in some ways. In Talmudic logic, however, every time you have a binary of two terms, like sameness and difference, we apply a little interesting twist to it, which is called shtayim shehem arba, two which are four. So what that basically means is that you have positive and negative qualities of sameness and positive and negative qualities of difference. What would this be in a everyday situation? So sameness, like that we're all like, for instance, of equal value, of infinite value. We all have the right to vote. We have certain examples of equality that appear for each and every person. That's a very positive sense of sameness to all of us. But if sameness meant that we're all interchangeable, like fungibility, like I could give you 5 ones for a 5, right? Like $5 bill, and it doesn't matter. Like the idea that someone could like swap out with you in your life, like take your rollover, or you could just swap out your spouse, or your car, or your kids, right? We like to think that that's not the case, that I'm somehow special and unique. We're not really all the same. So how do we navigate this feeling that we're both the same, but being equal also doesn't mean that we're all interchangeable, right? That would be like a negative sense of sameness. And the same thing occurs with difference. Difference can mean disparagement, like because you're different from me, I don't have to accord you the same ethical treatment. I can think of you as less than, right? Like difference is to disparage in one instance of it. That would be a negative instance. Or difference can mean uniqueness. You're special, you're unique, you're one of a kind, right? No one can replace you. So that's celebrated difference, right? So what we really actually have, and this is part of the problem on college campuses, I think, today, we sometimes don't have very well-defined vocabulary for even having political discussions. We sometimes find that equality is very good, sometimes difference is very good. Sometimes each one of those terms can be very bad, like equivocating between, let's say, someone who's going out and committing an act of murder or terror, and someone who's trying to prevent an act of murder or terror for happening as being, a police force of some form, right? They're not the same. Those are not the same. Maybe you want to equivocate between the two of them, but that gets very dangerous. And a lot of the discourses loses distinctions. It also sometimes makes distinctions where they're not. So actually one of the deep teachings about Sodom, as particular places, is that like their whole logic, their self-righteous logic was all messed up. In certain instances, they saw no differences where there should have been differences made, like extenuating circumstances. The context matters. You need to be able to differentiate. They couldn't differentiate. They equivocated everything. Like all acts of with a gun are the same, whether you're killing someone in murder or trying to save a life. They're all the exact same. That'd be totally losing a meaningful distinction that needs to be there, collapsing everything into the idea of sameness. And on the flip side, sometimes you have to see where things are really the same, like we're all the same. We all come from like a common source, like we're all made in a divine image. The idea that we're like common ancestor, whether it's in the Darwinian notion or even better yet in the sense in Genesis that we all come from the same place we all descend from one being, is like saying that no one can claim earlier ancestry, greater priority. No gender, no ethnicity, no religion, no any type of person, no race, right? We all come from the same starting point, which is sort of like equally distant or equally close to God. So that's the ultimate equality in some way. So to try to say, well, I'll treat this group respectfully, but not that group, because they're different. That's where being able to use sameness possibly is really, really important. So they didn't see where people are similar, where they needed to be similar, and they didn't see where they were different, where they needed to be different. And we've experienced this on college campuses quite a lot. Since October 7th, my wife and I have been very engaged in dialogue with students, and hopefully it materializes into dialogue eventually. Sometimes it starts as we're being shouted at. But particularly with students at Harvard, Yale, and Columbia, and UPenn, where they've been really like hot flashed areas of tremendous vitriol and so on. Those are the prime areas that we've been engaged in. And how do you get people to recognize that the other person is also a human being like you? You find the sameness, the similarities. How do you get someone else to recognize that two actions that may have occurred in these events are like maybe fundamentally different, even if they superficially look the same? I've had students tell me, well, you know, since all Jews are settlers, are colonizers, we should not extend the same ethical privileges, the same ethical concerns to Jews. That's something that's been said to me. And by and large, some of those same things have been said to like all people who are considered in a privileged class. Sometimes you will find on these campuses that will say that all white people are privileged, and therefore we don't have to extend the same ethical concern towards the white suppressor class because of historic considerations. So we don't see individual differences, or we don't see also similarities in either one of these circumstances. And a lot of this is because of new academic theories that some of them have really fantastic revelations that they've made that I think are positive, and other parts of them maybe are a little bit half-baked and need like some correction and rethinking. So we want to talk a little bit more about those in context. And it's not enough to just sweep them aside in one way, but that's what we're going to try to discuss. So besides our lack of being able to make distinctions when we need to, or see similarities when we need to, we have an even earlier episode that we can draw upon that might inform this conversation about all kinds of bigotry, including anti-Semitism. And that takes us all the way back to the original story in the Garden of Eden with Adam and Eve. And originally, prior to eating from the tree of knowledge, according to also the deleted scenes directed commentary of Midrashic literature, rabbinic commentary, the original stature of these two human figures, this original self-other relationship between Adam and Eve, was one where their bodies were entirely luminal. In fact, the only vestige of that luminosity of the body is our fingernails today. Like that's according to the tradition. Like our whole skin was like our fingernails. And we have to try to like think deeply into what this actually means. So if the body was made of or, Aleph, Vav, Resh, 3 Hebrew letters, which means light, a luminal body, it meant that we lived in a transparent society. That's actually the term we would use now. That like seeing someone, I would see into them and see who they truly are on their interior and not just their surface. So much of what we contend with today is a struggle between understanding substance and surface. Surface is just seeing like the outer image of someone and not into their interior to really know who they are. And actually, as a result of eating from the tree of knowledge, there was a transformation of the very embodiment of humanity, that the skin turned into skin that had opacity to it. Instead of being Aleph, Vav, Resh, these three Hebrew letters, the language game is more prevalent in Hebrew. It became Ayin, Vav, Resh, which is or skin. Sounds the same. The word for light and the word for skin sound the same. They're almost homonyms. But what is skin? The skin creates a self-other sort of partition and splits the world into like an inside and outside. I become duplicitous. Who I show myself on the surface to be and who I think I am and feel myself to be inwardly may not exactly be the same thing. And it's amazing that that word for skin also relates to the word iver, which is a kind of blindness. It means that, like, I'm actually not seeing something. I don't have access into the inner workings of other people. And so I may judge them based on surfaces. In a sense, all of the estrangement, all of the exile, all of the dislocation, all of the history of strife that occurs begins with this original transformation from us having luminal bodies to bodies of skin, from transparency to opacity, and everything becomes a skin problem. What's a skin problem? A skin problem is like we're all made up of a series of skins. It's like peeling the onion. It's like different screens, different surfaces that are supposed to be representational in nature that may give inadequate representation as to who the inner person might be. And because of that, we're exiled from the garden, but we're also like kind of estranged from one another. I like don't really see the real you. I just see this surface. And so it's not accidental that history is riddled with issues where we substitute substance for surface. And so we judge people based on race and skin, and we judge people based on other considerations that are their outer manifestation. And it's to quote Dr. King, it's not the color of their skin, but the content of their character. If we understand that distinction, that's a substance versus surface analysis. And that used to be the whole drive of a lot of what was happening in education, that we want to try to like see past surfaces and into people and evaluate them by the content of their character, which took us into an area that was very much about meritocracy, right? Like, what is this person's individual merits as opposed to seeing them as part of a group? And what's happened over time, actually, is there's been a tremendous amount of critique, some of it very justified, of meritocracy. Like, not everyone starts with equal opportunity. I can tell you at like elite colleges, there are certain parents that spend $1,000 an hour to get college prep tutoring and all kinds of other things to get their kids into school. Not everyone can afford that. That's like a little bit of a differentiator. So when we ask what is merit, where do we place that? What value do we assign to merit? This is part of the consideration. That's like the inner person, their individual performance on some level. And then we see historically that there are group identities that have their own collective journeys as well as individual journeys. Where do we place that in this whole scheme? Where does that come into play? And it's very difficult to know how to manage the analysis between these things. And so much of the educational environment today has pivoted back towards looking at individual identities, seeing the surface, seeing the outward ways in which we classify people and so on, and taking that into consideration. And where do we trace that to? In a certain sense, to be an anti-Semite relates to one of the three sons of Noah. Noah had three sons. One's name was Shem. So Shem literally means a name. So besides being a character also in James Joyce's inscrutable novel Finnegan's Wake, Shem is a name. So to be like an anti-Semite is like being an anti-Shemite. Like you don't like names. Names are classifications, they're identities in some ways. And sometimes identity is really, really important to recognize. There are times when identity, however, sometimes can be itself limiting. Is there a part of me that is defined by all the names that I have, that maybe I'm part of a tribe, right? That could be like any kind of grouping that I want to be part of. That comes into play, that is part of who I am. But sometimes that is itself inherently confining in some way. How do we see this? There's a famous description in the very beginning of the book of Exodus, where it says, Ve'ela Shmot, these are the names, so names plural, of the Jewish people, Aba'im Mitzrama, that they came into Egypt. Now, Egypt also is not just a historical place, a certain time, and it's not just talking about a Jewish phenomenon. It also has a symbolic meaning if you decode the name Egypt in Hebrew, Mitzrayim. And it has to do with seeing constriction and limitation. So what does it mean to put names into a place where they're limiting and confining? Because if you reread that verse, it's like saying, sometimes we bring our identities in a place where they're itself confining. What would be a confining sense of identity? Well, I'm on the green team and you're on the blue team, so we have nothing in common. We can't talk to one another. We get really, really, really competitive. Maybe we become nasty because we're on different teams. And lest we think that this is just something that happens with other people out in the world, you can run this experiment. They can do this all the time with especially teenagers. You can set up an athletic event and you'll divide arbitrarily the class into two, and you'll say, all right, these 10 people, you're the green team, and you give them green jerseys, and these 10 people are the blue team, and you give them blue jerseys, and shortly, they start hating on each other. They start heckling each other, they start getting really into their team dynamic and really disparaging the other team, and it can be taken to quite an extreme. We have a natural tendency to do that. We become partisan, we become oriented to our tribalism and so on. So you can celebrate tribe on some level. That's definitely good. It's important to remember collective identity. Again, we said to be anti-Semitic in a certain way would want to erase Jewish identity. Jewish names disappear out of existence. So we want to preserve our collective identity. That's certainly important from a Jewish perspective, and that's presumably true of just about any group that there is out in the world. And yet, there's a point in which we want to try to get beyond identity. So it's funny, even the soul in rabbinic literature has a variety of names. Hamisha Shmot Nikra'u La. The soul has 5 names to it. Nefesh, Ruach, Neshama, Chai, Yechida. These are the 5 names of the soul. They all basically mean soul, and they're different names. But there's actually a core essence of each person which has no name. It gets beyond identity in some way. And it's actually when we get beyond name and beyond identity that we find that ultimate commonality. We all come from the same place. And we can connect beyond identity politics and identitarianism, which is very much taken over the world. So we always risk representation with names, with identities, but we also have to remember there are the limits of representation. There are things that are unnameable, or unrepresentable. And actually, it's maybe when we realize that we can connect together even better and not be restricted in our various identities. Amazingly, in this week's Torah reading, it's so incredible to see how this actually chronicles with our talk. There's a whole discussion of what seems to be the biblical description of leprosy, tzarat. And you would think that this is just a terrible disease that bad people are afflicted with, but actually in the Jewish tradition, it's actually a disease that righteous people can get. It's really unusual that would be the case, that you could have this skin affliction that has to be healed, that's part of righteousness. And why is it? It says actually the individuals who get this, it's actually that they bring out, it's actually a play on the actual name in Hebrew, but they bring out a negative name about their others. And the word name, again, also implies a kind of identity. The way they think about the identities of people is negative in some way. And they get tripped up in a world where everything is all about identity. And interestingly, this is actually gets us deep into the academic roots of what's happening in the world today. Because what really has fueled the change on campus so much has been what we call postmodernism. And I basically majored in postmodernism as an undergrad and did quite a lot of it in grad school, so I'm somewhat familiar with it. And it's something like this. There are no longer any, according to this view, master narratives in the world. There's no story we can tell ourselves that like binds us all together. Everything is disputable, and everything is really just a power play. How we describe the world in words is really all about power. Now, one of the sort of initiators of this way of thinking was Michel Foucault, who actually spoke here at the University of Vermont in 1983. So it actually, we're in the shadow of a place where this type of thinking came into play. Now, it's quite possible that when we describe the world as constructed out of words, that a lot of it does have special interest associated with it. Maybe there are a lot of power dynamics in it. But to say that the world, there's no world beyond words is a little bit problematic. So in Jewish mysticism, the person who is afflicted with this skin disease, they actually are lacking in something called chokhmah, which usually translates to wisdom. But it's actually the ability to get beyond yourself and to like see the other person, see into their face individually, and get beyond words. The world that's constructed, or reality that's constructed through words, is related to what we call bina. And if you're going to talk in neuroscience, we talk about the lateralization in the brain. Relatively speaking, the left hemisphere is much more logical, linguistic based, and how it deals with everything. And you can get stuck in a little bit of a prison house in your mind, where everything is like just a play of words and identities, and you don't know how to get beyond it to just like connect to the person even without words. That's associated actually with the right hemisphere of the brain. So if we get into a war of words, which is a lot of what's happening now on campus, and an identitarian conflict, this identity is not being represented versus that identity not being represented, that's all related to the left hemisphere, both in neuroscience and also in Jewish mysticism. And it says that that's where we're stuck. Someone who's trying to be righteous, but is struggling with names, with identities, is because they're lacking this attribute of wisdom on the right hemisphere of the brain, which allows me to see beyond those differences to our commonality, to an experience of unity, beyond name, beyond identity. So it's actually discussed in these particular passages, and this comes up in all kinds of different theories. But these academic theories, even the originators of them, may not recognize what they've devolved into on today's college campuses. And that would include Foucault and many others that like initiated some of these discussions, that a lot of them were on the left camp of the intellectual spectrum. A lot of them were neo-Marxian in their thinking, but they themselves were a little more sophisticated than some of the discourse that's happening today. And part of what's changed that has to do actually with the technological world that we're immersed in. There's an interesting book that came out recently. It's one of an entire cottage industry of treatises talking about the ills of social media and what social media has done to society. And this book is called The Chaos Machine by Max Fisher. And one of the things it points out is we are in a world today that has a zero-sum game of attention. The attentional economy is such that if you want people to put eyeballs on your particular video or on your article, you gotta do something because there's too many competing stimuli to try to draw that attention in, right? And part of the problem that I think a lot of students I've encountered on campus find is that they're used to long discourses like this that go on until the sun is eclipsed. But truthfully, what they're contending with on social media is often like these little short TikTok videos that sum up very complex issues like Middle Eastern politics, right, in a very short amount of time. It's very ironic. So like some of the college campuses we've encountered, there are kids that their entire narrative about the Middle East is informed by TikTok videos or other social media that they watch, which encapsulate this stuff in a very short format that's usually lacking in nuance. It's a little bit of a Procrustean bed. Some of the people that actually have lived there and been over there, have actually an amazing conversation about it if they're willing to. Like one of my son's suite mates for next year at Yale is Palestinian from Gaza. They get along fine. They ask each other how their families are all the time. They could actually have like a lengthy discussion about it. But if you're just a TikTok person, you may not see that. And what charges social media that we found in all these studies is identity. If you really want to get people worked up, you have to immerse them in identity thinking. We're this type of person, we're that type of person. It's even better than clickbait. And if you want to go even further with identity, I stack on top of poking that part of your brain that is stimulated by identitarian thinking, I poke the part of your brain that also gets angry. Because if you want a message to travel long and far on social media, you have to evoke anger. I'm super angry with what's going on. And better even than anger, the absolute maximizing of anything that you want to market on social media is moral outrage. I cannot believe there's no sneeze guard at the salad bar. This is absolute atrocity. I am going to the UN and I am going to take this. Terrible, right? Like, if you want anyone to pay attention, it's got to be the worst, the most extreme thing that you can put out there to create social outrage, because that's what's going to get the eyeballs. That's what's going to get the attention. And people said, basically, harnessing community to create hyper-partisan identities, and then turning people from persons into symbols, right? So now you're not a Jew, you're just a settler, a colonist, a colonizer, right? We've substituted you. You have no face any longer, right? You're just part of a generality. And it could be any group. This is not obviously limited to anti-Semitism, but this is what's creating the online chaos. This is being amplified over and over again by how algorithms are functioning on these sites. In fact, for some social media platforms, if engagement slumps off by like 0.1%, they will actually tweak the algorithm to privilege content that's even more incendiary, more extreme, to get people back watching it. And this has been documented over and over again. So it's no wonder that everyone's at everyone's throat. This is also pulling the United States apart, right? Because our perception of the world is such that everyone is super extreme, because that gets fed to us over and over and over again. And interestingly, when we think about shortcuts, another function of the mind is if you're exposed to the same message over and over and over again, ad nausea, you eventually become so familiar with it, you actually use it as a way of not having to think, to just accept it as reality. We actually call this the illusory truth effect, right? Exposure to the same message through the algorithm over and over again, eventually you become so acclimated, you just eventually just adopt it as true. And that's been shown endless time, and it has to do with this danger of overfamiliarity. And if you're aware of that, then you realize we become habituated to certain messaging because it just blankets the airwaves, and we can start to guard a little bit about it and to ask, can we think critical about it? Maybe we can't summarize a whole group of people or an individual or a whole nation based on just like these little sound bites that we happen to get. And so we have to look out for how that's operated. But the psychology behind this is well known to the people who create these platforms, and it's been weaponized because it's actually very marketable. But it's created actual global conflicts as a result of it. And another part of it that's so hard, that was actually a deliberate step. At one point, Facebook was plateaued in terms of its growth of its platform. Membership reached about 90 million. They realized they weren't growing much beyond that. And looking at it with their social psychologists, they had sort of capped the number of friends you could have to a certain threshold that's known as the Dunbar limit. The Dunbar limit is the number of people you can manage in your daily life and know in a kind of meaningful way without becoming overwhelmed. It's about 150 people. You can manage about 150 relationships in a kind of ongoing way regularly before you so overtax your brain that you get an amygdala reaction, which is like the fight, flight, and freeze. Like the level of anxiety and anxiousness goes up. And they said it would be bad if we like turn this feature off that kind of caps people at the Dunbar limit. But we want to grow, so okay, let's just cancel it. And then suddenly people could have thousands and thousands and thousands of friends on social media. And you can actually chart to this point, this decision, the increase in anxiety and depression and all kinds of other social ills, particularly amongst teens. It shot up massively. In fact, correlation does not equal causation, but we do see that the average age of onset, like debilitating anxiety, went from like 28 to 14 over this sort of period of time. So it warrants further study, let's put it that way. Very, very interesting. So how has social media then created an even more volatile culture? And does it not even add an amplifier effect on college campuses? Those who are the most immersed in this world are the most impacted by it. And so it's not accidental that the message that's making the most rounds is the one that tends to get amplified uncritically over and over again. So how do we tackle that? The truth of the matter is, if we're making everyday decisions, most of us are all about going through our lives, and we make those decisions largely unconsciously, very rapidly, and they're not particularly accurate. The decisions, they're error-prone, like a lot of those things, right? Just kind of going, I'm on autopilot throughout most of the day. And if I'm flipping through a million news stories and I just see more familiar things, oh, it's another thing, it's another one of those stories. It must be true because it's like the other 70 that I saw earlier this week, right? There's no critical thinking in that whatsoever. Truly, if we're using a different heuristic to discover our world, which is complex decision making, that's slow, very conscious, deliberate, it requires effort, and it's very reliable. But that's not what's being encouraged today. Like deep thought is not there. In fact, just being on the internet has changed the architecture of the human brain. You'll see that attentional capacities are more staccato-like. The way we read is fundamentally different. So there's a lack of nuance, and perhaps that has to be dishabituated in order to change it. So the only way we can do that is we have to put a message out there that is so unusual that a person can't easily assimilate it to what they already know. Because that's what we pay attention to. Everything that's familiar, we kind of zone out. It becomes colorless in the background. But if I tell you something that's like totally new and shocking or unusual, then suddenly you're paying attention. So like how can we do that to create better discourse, better political discourse all around? How would that handle some of the anti-Semitism that is happening in the world today? But let's revert back to the campus theories that have come out of postmodernism a little bit more. So some of them have to do with again, very great causes, trying to look for greater social justice in the world. Of course, you have people like Hayek who would say that the social justice is a fine sentiment that can go quite awry depending upon who's pursuing it. And if they think you almost like in an idealistic way that with enough intervention we can remake society to perfection. Society is perfectible if we just change it. Well, we already have experienced if we know history, and unfortunately we live in a generation that's in the nearly now, that's maybe a little bit ahistorical, but if we know history, we know that that's not always the case looking back when we've tried to have like very rigidly top-down planned economies or planned societies. Look at the former Soviet system, for instance, and what human misery was brought about as a result of trying to do those things. So while the impulse to want to find justice in the world is great, How you execute that is where things can go off, especially if you're not patient and think about nuance. You can really go very far afoot on something like that. And that's why we've really fallen into a place that's driven much more by ideology. And one of the hallmarks of ideology is that it's very intolerant of dissent. So luckily, this is not all college students. It's not all college administrations. It's a subset, but you will find some people that you have to fit into this particular ideological lane, and it's no longer open to what we normally think of as a democracy of negotiating between diverging viewpoints. Those don't tend to happen as much as maybe we would like, right? And in fact, if you even, according to some people who've gotten very militant in this school of thought, if you even entertain discussion with someone who doesn't already agree with you, you are already complicit in their crimes in a certain way, right? It's like disallowing what we would think of in classic liberalism, to be able to tolerate different behaviors, different ideas, to talk about them with civil discourse and so on in an open kind of way, as opposed to screaming. Now, I don't know about you, but if somebody wants to convey a message to me, they could either sit down, have a cup of coffee, and talk civilly for an hour over the cup of coffee, or they could scream at me with a megaphone. Which way do you receive messages better? I don't know. So we've actually walked into the middle of some of these protests that all screaming with megaphones, and we try to pull people out, and we sit and we talk to them, be like, hey, why don't, instead of screaming, why don't you have conversations? Why don't you have people who think differently on this issue sit down, talk to one another, look face to face? Because actually when you look face to someone, they're no longer a symbol for something, they're an individual. They might surprise you. You might have, instead of maybe the same position, maybe you don't have that, but you might have common interests in making a better world. And then maybe you can work towards those common interests. It's all about how you pursue it. So that was not the message that certain students got. Herbert Marcuse was one of the particular thinkers who spawned a lot of this critical theory and critical social justice. And he wrote an essay back in 1965 called Repressive Tolerance. And he was following up really on a view that Karl Popper had, which basically argues that if you are tolerant to the intolerant, you will lose all capacity to be tolerant. So therefore, you must be intolerant to intolerance. However, in Popper's view, Karl Popper, when he was talking about that from a political standpoint, he was really talking about the backdrop of Nazi Europe. Yes, there are instances where the intolerant people are literally going to come in and invade you with military. That's a little bit different than what's going on in today's college campuses, which he would say, try to sit down and have a meaningful discussion with someone to try to change their view. But Marcuse actually said no, the cause is so just, so high conviction to the cause, that you should be militant in not tolerating any dissent whatsoever or any other type of speaking, which obviously creates a whole host of problems. How do you contend with those problems? So interestingly, both thinkers on the political right and the political left have become political odd couples, if you will, that have come out in protest of this and realize that we need a liberal society, especially if education is going to work. We really need to reaffirm liberal society where we can entertain different views and opinions and behaviors and have civil discourse about them and free speech about them. And therefore, there are books that have come out. I think the most famous, the one that I've been getting everyone to read, is The Coddling of the American Mind. Could I see anyone read The Coddling of the American Mind here? Okay. So a few people brought out. This is Greg Lukianoff and Jonathan Haidt. And they talked about how the prevailing wisdom that has started to take seed in many of our institutions of learning is based on what almost every ancient world tradition of wisdom, whether it be the Torah or pretty much anything else, agrees are the great untruths. 3 great untruths. And the first of these untruths is whatever doesn't kill you makes you weaker. And this has to do with safetyism. Safetyism, like if I'm exposed to views that I don't like, they're going to somehow make me weaker. They're gonna, like it means that I'm not as committed to the cause. It might threaten me in some way. Words can be violent. Those types of things. Like I don't have the grit and the resilience to survive such verbal encounters with people that I don't necessarily agree with. So I want to ask one, like, why is broccoli healthy for you? Does anyone know why broccoli is healthy for you? Any idea? Do you know that broccoli is a mild poison? And the reason it's healthy for you is because it poisons you a little bit. And because it poisons you, you get an immune response. This actually has to do with the science of hormesis. Hormesis is like you actually, by being under a little bit of stress, right, threatening your immune system or something like a little bit of trauma, right, actually produces this huge turbocharge response, which actually kicks you into high gear and is tremendously good for your health. It's the same reason behind what's called sometimes the James Bond shower or the cold plunge, like the Arctic plunge. Like you want to really get your day going without 5 cups of coffee, get into like freezing cold shower in the middle of Vermont February, and you're awake, you're so alive. At the time, you're screaming in pain. It's very uncomfortable. But let me tell you, it's like 8-hour energy, because for the rest of the day, you're going to be wired, right? As a result of that, it's the same thing with broccoli. So this hormesis is like a little bit of things that are uncomfortable, that are a little bit traumatizing to you, that we sometimes want to keep away from, actually are what gives us our resilience. It actually confirms our identities in a certain way. Wow, if I can be mocked for my black hat and my beard because it's out of fashion, and I still wear it proudly walking down the street, right? Then I know I'm very committed to who I am, right? Because I didn't need the approval of other people to accept myself, right? That's like the broccoli or the cold shower in identity here. And in that sense, there's something about exposure even to anti-Semitism or other types of negative things in the world that actually is, in a weird way, redemptive. There's actually a verse in Jeremiah and Yirmiyahu which reads, the 8th Sarahi, it was a time of distress, Yaakov to Jacob, which is referring to the Jewish people, Umimena Yivashea, and from it you will be delivered. Right? And most people think that, okay, bad situation, I'm just going to get you out of the bad situation. But actually there's a little bit of syntactic ambiguity in Hebrew, and you can actually understand that the bad situation, the stressful time itself is what brings about the salvation. Meaning that all the stuff going on right now on college campuses is an incredible positive opportunity to figure out what we're really all about. To figure out what we really think, to be challenged. We don't have to just say, oh, this is just terrible, walk away. It's like, see all of this as a tremendous learning opportunity to become stronger, right? So the real truth in the ancient world is not that which doesn't kill me makes me weaker, it's that what doesn't kill me makes me stronger, right? And that's the secret of, actually the time of distress is what delivers me, gives me certain kind of redemptive promise. What is the second of the 3 laws, great untruths rather, that are talked about in the Coddling of the American Mind? This is called the idea of emotional reasoning, which is always trust your emotions. I think we have some kids in the background. I would like to try, would you like the 54th, a butterscotch candy today or not, right? And you blow up and so on, and they have a whole fit. Like the idea that emotions are certainly an important part of our lives, an important gauge. There's no question about it. But all wisdom traditions agree that emotions should be tempered by rationality, by the intellect. In Hebrew, we talk about moach shalit al lev. The mind should rule over the heart. Like the brain is supposed to prune our emotions, to refine them, to uplift them in some profound way, right? So just whatever your lived experience emotionally, if it can't also be evidenced and made sense to the mind, if you can't falsify it, right, which is part of what makes something like entered into the scientific world, if it doesn't have falsifiability, maybe I need to also refine my emotions. It's not to discount emotions. Emotions are very, very valuable, but to contextualize them, untempered in any kind of way, just emotions themselves, run into terrible problems. And you can see it. One student will say, well, I feel threatened because I don't like your political view. And another student right in front of me would tell that student, but I feel threatened because I don't like your particular view. Well, whose emotions went out, right? We got two, like you see it with two kids. You know, if you have little kids and they're fighting, like whose emotions win in this particular instance, right? Like it's hard to assess that, especially from an outside perspective, right? It's very, very difficult. So it's not just always trust your emotions. Emotions are calculating the equation, unquestionably. Sometimes they're discounted. We are not machines. We should not just be purely rational, but they have to be tempered and contextualized. And then the third, which is the most important of the three great untruths in the coddling American mind, is life is a battle between good people and bad people. And this actually stems from an ancient Christian heresy known as Manichaeism that sees like good and evil as like totally separate forces in the world. They're not intermingled. And in a certain sense, all you have to do is get rid of the evil, get rid of the bad people. You know, and I met college students who said this, we could just get rid of all the conservative professors on campus. And I'm thinking to myself, there aren't many here to begin with, but okay, you know, like, and you could say equally the other way. I'm sure in another context, there are conservatives who say we could just get rid of all of the leftist Marxist professors, then we'd be good, right? All we have to do is get rid, and that, like, everything will be perfect. Like, all the virtue is just getting rid of whatever that negativity, which is entirely seen within individual people. And the view, certainly the more normative view, and the view from a Jewish perspective, is that, truthfully, we always have to experience inter-inclusion. We're all deeply connected. None of us is an island. And in good and evil are always intermingled. And we had a very interesting Vermont resident and Nobel laureate known as Solzhenitsyn. Probably some of you heard from him. And I would like to now read his response to the great untruth of life is a battle between good people and bad people. This is from his work, Gulag Archipelago. The line separating good and evil passes not through states, nor between classes, nor between political parties either, but right through every human heart. And through all human hearts, the line shifts. Inside us, it oscillates with the years. And even within hearts overwhelmed by evil, one small bridgehead of good is retained. Meaning that no one in identitarian thinking, quite often, not always, I'm not going to also label all people who think about DEI or critical race theory or any of these things in one lump, but there is a subset of people for whom there is no toleration for an entire group because the line of good and evil runs between them, not within them. And they also don't allow that line to move. There's no redemption. There's no sense that a person can go from being your enemy to your friend just by greeting them, talking to them face to face, realizing that your common interest in creating a better world. So in order to find solutions to take us forward with all of this, first of all, I'd like to cite two verses from the book of Exodus that are that go together, these two verses. One of them, in Exodus 23:6, states that you should not pervert the justice of a poor person in their particular struggle or lawsuit, their dispute. That's you have to give someone, even if they're not a privileged person, they're not part of the upper class, the dominant class, whatever they might be, they're impoverished, right? That you have to give them fair justice. But there's a second verse that goes along and complicates it, which is that you can't glorify someone who's just because they're poor, that means you can't pervert justice for their claims, either. Like, you can't say there's no, and this is, you'll find this. Sometimes there's assumption if someone's a victim that they're automatically on the side of righteous. And if someone has power, they're automatically an oppressor. That's sometimes the equation that is there. So the extending of the same justice has to be for all people, not just for some people, whether they're in one position or the other. Those are very important complementary ideas that I think resonate in today's academy. The next one I would say is and we're almost done, and the eclipse will come soon. My wife's starting to bring out the batons to wave the plane down. But in the Talmud, we see that the two great sages known as Hillel and Shammai were always having disputes all the time. And what we find between them is that despite having all these disputes, they still could remain good friends. It was always civil discourse. And the Jewish tradition is almost always to side with Hillel over Shammai. And one of the reasons for that is he knew Shammai's position on matters of Jewish law even better in a certain respect than his own. And the way we refer to that today in the modern academy is called steelmanning the other person's arguments versus straw manning. So much of what will happen in political discourse, especially on the modern academy, is because we have already been used to social media putting us in echo chambers and silos, is that if we have any other dissenting opinion, it's really a straw man's opinion. It's not something really thoroughly known. Like, I'm happy to report I have all of the neo-Marxist books that have led to all the modern theories. I own all of them. I actually enjoy reading them, including Foucault and Marcuse. I've read Popper. All of those books I've studied for many, many years. There are great sparks of wisdom in some of them. There are other things that need work. I have no problem celebrating that. How you know the other person's side, like how you want that to occur, is a fundamentally different type of approach to how we think about learning today. There are some amazing examples of this. Cornel West and Robert George are certainly on the opposite ends of the political spectrum, and yet they have gone around speaking on college campuses, trying to reinstill liberal debate and civil discourse, and it's actually a beautiful thing to see. Our families had interactions with both of them, and it can be done, and it's amazing when it happens. It's amazing what we learn when we don't straw man the other person, we steel man them, to use the proverbial expression. But what sometimes happens at campuses, and we've encountered this as well, is they'll say, well, we allow for all opinions here. We have one very big lecture with someone who's calling for the destruction of Israel in one lecture hall, and there's 250 people at that lecture. And then somewhere else in campus, in some small classroom, there are 8 people listening to a Holocaust survivor speak and contextualizing Israel and framing it as a response to the Holocaust in some way, right? You have both those, so they're both happening at the same campus, but none of the same audience is hearing the same message. A much more intellectually honest way would be to have both speakers in the same room with the exact same audience, so everyone's hearing all of the same things. That's not happening. So that's something that could improve things greatly. And you don't want to get the best speaker ever on one particular view. Like if you bring Foucault in, he's no longer with us, but if you bring someone of his stature in to speak on one position, you got to bring someone of similar caliber to come and speak to like a counterpoint position. Otherwise, are you really learning anything, right? Like putting that together. So how can we be face to face? And finally, I want to leave you with a excerpt from a letter. It's actually part of the postscript of a letter from 1984 that the Lubavitcher Rebbe, whose institution this is, sent to Professor Alan Dershowitz at Harvard Law School. And he was talking about anti-Semitism, since it was a little bit of an odd topic for me even to talk about anti-Semitism, as you'll see with this particular topic. And he's writing Dershowitz, and he's talking about how they actually, Chabad had invited the Jewish leaders had invited this one particular senator who had some questionable politics, at least from Dershowitz' perspective. How could you invite such a person? It's like, how could you invite the speaker into your world, platform them in some kind of way? And this was his response. He said, "I believe, therefore, that the proper approach to such persons by Jewish leaders should not be rigid. As a rule, it does no good to engage in a cold war, which may often turn into a hot war, nor does it serve any useful purpose to brand one as an enemy or an anti-Semite, however tempting it is to do so, even if that person vehemently denies it. It can only be counterproductive. On the contrary, ways and means should be found to persuade such a person to take a favorable stance, at least publicly. We haven't too many friends, and attaching labels, etc., will not gain us any." So interestingly, the Lubavitcher Rebbe's approach to anti-Semitism was, in a certain sense, to sidestep it and focus on the common interest, creating a better world and positivity, and not labeling people, because the minute we label people and say, this person is this type of person, that person is that type of person, we arrest their development. They can't contain difference in themselves. And so as much as we need social justice, we also need forgiveness and tolerance, and to empower everyone to bring forth their best self. Thank you very much. So if anyone wants to ask any questions, that's fine. Otherwise, we're selling solar goggles down below. No. Yes?
So, your last comment suggests that, and it's a sentiment that maybe I sympathetic with, is that using the word anti-Semitism to describe someone, I'm not comfortable with that. Really, because it's, we've got enough of that in our society. So, I wonder if you can elaborate on that.
Well, as Solzhenitsyn said, even if the person seems to be anti-Semitic at the beginning, like, you're not, by labeling them in some way and fixing them in that way, you're not affording them the opportunity to change. Some people may have seen recently in the news media, because he's always speaking, the son of Hamas, who is like a former child of one of the lead Hamas members, who's become a very big advocate for Israel and has a very pro-Western stance. Anyone can become anything if we encourage them to bring forth their best self. The worst is when someone gets pigeonholed in one way, and then obviously sometimes you have to defend, there's an immediate call to action, and you have no way of avoiding it. But to the degree possible, isn't it best if we can understand people as having the ability to reshape and refashion their identity? Because the ultimate person there is beyond any of those appearances. That's the bridgehead to the good that I think Solzhenitsyn is talking about.
But can I just follow up?
Yeah.
I mean, you were talking in generalities about tribalism and about
Yes.
the other and not seeing. Doesn't, and I'm going to use the word anti-Semitism. That has such it just comes up in history time and time and time again. So
It does.
why is that so enduring? Or maybe it's not. Maybe I'm just not seeing.
Right.
Maybe I'm just not seeing other things. But it seems like that's more enduring than any other kind of otherism.
So the Lubavitcher Rebbe said it's actually sort of hardwired seemingly into the nature of the world as we encounter it. But what deeply underscores this and other forms of bigotry is actually a void in meaning. If people find meaningful, purposeful pursuits in their lives, things that are bigger than them, they generally don't need to build themselves up by deprecating someone else. So in addition to not fighting anti-Semitism directly and focusing on the positive, the best thing we can do is to encourage all people to pursue things that are truly meaningful and to spread good throughout the world. Yeah.
Yes, I'm curious how you gauge just the temperature of anti-Semitism or racism or all the other isms. I guess from the statistics that I've seen, that some of them indicate that hate crimes are at an all-time
Steven Pinker wrote a wonderful book called The Angels of Our Better Nature, and he shows by basically every statistic the world is safer, less violent, more tolerant. Like almost everyone would disavow and condemn slavery and other forms of racism and bigotry today in the world. Like that's the case, and yet a very small vocal minority, with the amplification of certain social media, is making it as though certain of these things are terrible. Like a good example of that would be, some of the terrible things that have happened with police, like the George Floyd incident that got magnified everywhere in the world. What is not seen, though, on social media or in the news is that there are literally hundreds and hundreds of millions of interactions between police every day with ordinary citizens that don't go like that, right? Like, and obviously we'd like a world that has no like violence and injustice to it. Obviously, we aspire to that. But it's important to contextualize that information and talk about progressing in that way, as opposed to understanding things as like, oh, it's all terrible. What really are those statistics? So I would recommend that book for anyone really wanting to see the decrease in so many of those problems throughout the world. And what's amazing is I've traveled around, I've met people from all over, including from Iran. You would think that Iran and Israel are just at endless loggerheads, but I've met many Iranians that are pro-West, have no issue with Israel. Like you would think it's an entire country from the news media that's just gearing up to destroy Israel off the face of the earth. It's a very distorted picture through that lens. So it's always important to keep those things in mind. Yeah.
You had mentioned that you go onto college campuses and they're screening and you picked out a few. I'm just curious, because I've encountered trying to carry on a conversation with some young folk, and they just have such blinders on, and they just keep very angrily back at you. What are some of the methods that you use to try to break that pottery of their mind where they are just stuck?
So you can't start with going head to head on a position of an issue. That does not work. And actually, one of the things we've talked about, Lenore and I, is having a follow-up talk just about the psychology of persuasion, how you do that. And often you have to move people incrementally, and you talk about, again, common interests. People are often shocked if you start I want every human being to live a full, successful, happy, healthy, enriched life. Not to survive, but to thrive. And if you start somehow there, they already don't expect that. that immediately the temperature is dialed down on some level. Because there's this projection that you're a symbol of something, that you just want conquest, or you want to spread misery because you don't agree with what they say. That's not the case at all. And so the things that you would think need not be stated actually sometimes have to be stated right up front in order to lower the temperature. But perhaps we'll do another talk at some point on this very subject. Yeah.
You spent a lot of time talking about the college students, and I remember my father saying to me many years ago, I wish I were 19 and knew everything again. But you haven't accounted for the elites, the Gutierrez's of the UN and the WHO, and the head of UNRWA has now become the head of the ICRC, and so forth. How do you account?
So many of the notions, first of all, there's still good old-fashioned anti-Semitism in the world. Also, the anti-Semitism that has been often the inadvertent consequence of some of the theories that are still maturing in the modern academy have been very successfully adopted and exported into branches of government, into the corporate world, and so on, without thinking through what all of their consequences are. And it's not like that it's an integrally bad thing to think about, well, how may I not be, how am I relating to others, and do I relate to them in a just and fair way? That's great that we have time to think about that. It's interestingly that it's found more commonly with people of privilege themselves are on this particular wavelength of thinking, because people who are driven by necessity don't have time to go to the 4-day protests on campus. It's a different kind of thing. You already have to have a certain capacity to be able to take these types of things on. And yet, again, where have we seen in history things that began really with great intentions? I don't need to try to divine the mind and heart of people on campuses or various professors that have put forth these theories. I can assume the best of all of them. Let's just start there. I want to assume the best of everyone. And yet, always when we try to change things in society, there often are unintended consequences. And we have to sometimes acknowledge that and revisit, where in our thinking that came to this. And sometimes it's, again, things that sounded wonderful. Originally, many people looked for and continue to look for equality of opportunity, equal opportunity. So much of the conversation sometimes has changed into equal outcomes that has occurred. What types of changes, surgical changes, do we have to make that could be very totalitarian to society to try to create a situation where there are equal outcomes? How have we not read George Orwell? How have we not read Solzhenitsyn and seen what these societal experiments have done in the past? And do we have the access to even know always what constitutes equal or what is different and what is deserved? In a Jewish framework, we actually apply a two-tiered approach to every person. And this has to do with the circle and the square, which have to be harmonized so it's not like Sodom way back in the beginning. There's a way in which we treat everyone the same, because we're all made in God's image, which is just a way of saying everyone's of infinite value and ultimately unrepresentable. We don't represent God in an image. So you're also beyond all representation and of infinite value. And so I owe you certain ethical behavior, a certain ethical way of relating, just based on your being, just who you are, right? And it's somewhat like children. We have our children and we love them just because they're our children, right? So we love people. You're just humans. For being human being, that we love you. And we have certain responsibility towards you. That's it. On the other hand, we have another mode of assessment, and we actually see them not one or the other, but as complementary facets of our life. And that's where we reward performance. You were given a little bit to work with. What did you make of it? Right? Did you clean your room with the time you had? So if we give everyone, you see this with kids, if you give every child the same allowance, whether they clean their room and do their chores or not, the kids who clean the house are going to get really angry at the kids who didn't clean the house who got the same allowance. And this gets into the language of meritocracy. Meritocracy does have a place. It's how we do differentiate ourselves, individual differences, and that should perhaps be part of the equation. But it's counterbalanced with another sense of everyone's a human being, that we love all the same and equal. So there's both some times to differentiate and also times to see everyone as the same. And how do we negotiate between those two things is a constant, complex thing that we're all trying to figure out. Right? As opposed to saying, okay, we were all about meritocracy. And it didn't matter. It was actually politicians on the left and the right were all trumpeting meritocracy in the past, and then it pivoted all away from meritocracy. It just became about identity, who you are, right? And each one has a kind of excess potential to it. But the idea of complementarity is a really hard balance to get to sustain both views at the exact same time. Anyone else? Yeah.
So I would add to your book list the word applies.
Oh, yes, yeah.
So I kept thinking when you were talking about the three anti-concepts, I feel.
Yeah, great untruths.
The great untruths, right? I kept thinking of an example in creation. Foresters know this in different language. Strong winds, strong trees.
Yep.
So the adversity strengthens the immune response, as you said.
Yeah. That's hormesis, absolutely.
Too much of one thing, floodwaters, rots the roots.
Yep.
And then the final one, which is not great for us who are advancing in age, is that the canopy can actually choke out the new and the better and the stronger unless it falls away either through harvest or through a natural event.
Yeah.
And I think there's I think that's a strong analogy to what you're talking about. And I wanted to say this, I keep hearing this voice about your first section, approaching people with the knowledge that there is something unknowable about them, that only God can know about them. And that goes back to what you talked about, their infinite worth. And that there's something about me and my wife that I'll never know, but only God knows about her, but for some reason He put us together. And that may be a way to bridge a gap in a way that maybe only people who have read God's Word know.
Right.
Or can understand.
Well, interestingly, and this is where the left hand should talk to the right hand a little more. In the academy, right, when we think about postmodernism and critical theory, a lot of those things trace their origins back into the Frankfurt School, which actually took a lot of theological concepts and rendered them in a kind of philosophic way. And they might talk about that same idea as like radical otherness or alterity. Like just being other, like that the person is a surplus or excess that overflows any concept we might have from them, and that we can never fully represent ourselves or others. And that alterity or otherness is, in a religious context, like the infinite value that only God knows, and they actually pulled it from that and then put it into secular philosophy from that. So ironically, these two things actually meet up in strange places, but that conversation needs to happen. That's why there's like extraordinary convergence, ironically also happening, I would say, between very different ways of viewing the world, and yet only if we have the right kind of conversation can we even acknowledge that in the modern day academy. So that's, I think, exciting.
So I would follow up and say, I think of postmodernism as anyone who still believes that God isn't dead is a threat to that.
So again, the idea in this particular tradition is like there's just some radical otherness to being. Whether or not they want to ascribe that to a personal God or not is very interesting. And whether there's like a unity of all being and all beings, we're all together, that's also something that's often very discussed. It's what's called the theological turn in philosophy, which ironically was adopted by a lot of especially Theodor Adorno and Walter Benjamin. There's a lot of theorists who actually sort of like fuel postmodernism that brought those things. And even other postmodernists like Derrida was a great interpreter of religious discourse in a philosophic idiom. Some of the later generations of students maybe don't realize that in like the modern day implementation of these ideas. Again, many of these theorists probably wouldn't recognize the social media attacks that are happening as representing the flag bearing of their very theories. So I got to differentiate a little bit. Yeah, thank you. Last question.
Thank you so much for just speaking to this. I see something that really resonated with me is that people like to the immediate truth. Like we want to see it, and there's no such thing as fact checking, or your facts just reinforce what your beliefs are. And then also just in Burlington itself, a lot of people, equity and equality have been really, really confused. And my question is, I have young kids, you have kids that are in college. Like, what can we do in a world that feels very pervasive, and like those are the truths that are becoming, and they're the easy truth, and they feel like they're a part of something. What can we do? Yes, I understand starting with conversations, but to help prevent this kind of like you said, like on TikTok or on social media, how continuously the constant feedback. What can we practically do that's living here?
Right. So first of all, we have to understand the value of short form content today. Like, this is the biggest problem. Somebody sits down and wants to talk about some of these issues. It's like, oh yeah, I'd like to give you a 2-hour dissertation now. And they're like, no. So what can you give me in 20 seconds, right? So we have to understand the media age that we are and meet people where they're at, right? So chunking it down into ways. And then finding, like through storytelling or brilliant examples, ways in which those can manifest. So I'll give you one example for education. So normally in education, you have like the same amount of time to go through your various grades, including college here at UVM. You have the same amount of time, and you have variable outcomes. Some kids get C's, B's, A's, right? It differentiates people and so on. So at Khan Academy, they ask, can we flip the script on this? Like, after all, would you want to be in a building where, the student who built it, they got 70% on the foundation was well done, and then the first floor was 60%, and the third floor is 20%, sound, right? I don't know if you'd want to be in that building, right? So if that building is mathematics, and you've got kids that are passing with a C from second grade math, and then by the time they're in fifth grade math, they can't even pass, right? So you have variable outcomes, even while everyone marches through the same curriculum at the same time. So how do you flip the script? So Khan Academy said, maybe everyone studies level 1, so they get their foundation 100%, and they have variable amounts of time. So for one person, they did it in 6 months, another student took 2 years, another student maybe 3 years, whatever it is, you get 100% on the first level, second level, third level. So you have the same outcomes, equal outcomes, but variable time. So it still embraces this idea of difference and sameness together. It's so hard for our brains to take that paradox and put them together. But that would be a great idea in education to show how you could change society in ways like, I want to get everyone so they know every subject to 100%. Just might take different amounts of time. Maybe we need to support that. That's a type of theory that is at least a gesture in this direction. And maybe we can find other and better examples, and maybe we're all responsible for popularizing some of those things. So thank you so much for coming out. Once again, I hope I've darkened the sky, but not for too long. Thank you very much.